Politics, that's what we're talking right now. There's so much happening in the run-up to these elections. There's 12 days to go. Can you believe it? 12 days before South Africa goes to the polls. So let's break it down, tell you what's been happening. In the past week, ANC members from the Free State and Mpumalanga have taken the party to court. Political parties have brought out the old guard in the campaign trails, and the PIC hears some very interesting testimony. So let's get some analysis on some of these stories and more. In studio with me, political analyst Khaya Sithole. Always good to see you, Khaya.
Likewise.
Thank you so much. Lots to get through, so let's begin. These two court cases, ANC and in the Free State and Mpumalanga, taking the party to court. What do you make of this?
It is a problem for the ANC, and I think obviously at the center of the dispute is really the question of who gets to be elevated into political office after the election. And keep in mind, of course, that the ANC has had the provincial and the national list conferences where names were then put forward. But of course, the names that are put forward by the branches are not necessarily the final list, because that list can also be adjusted in order to get the gender representation right, for example. So of course, some people are going to be disgruntled because you based in a particular province, as far as you're concerned, you've met whatever the threshold is in that particular province for your name to be put on the list. And then when you see on the IEC's final list that your name is not there, you've got a right to be disgruntled and then question the processes. And I think, of course, a lot of them don't think that the process is transparent enough. And when that transparency is missing, it then sort of creates a lot of anxiety with people who say, but what else did I need to do in order to get my name on the list? So I think that is the basis for these cases.
Okay, so let's break it down into the respective provinces. We'll talk Mpumalanga first. So the disgruntled party members basically made a court application calling for the PEC to be dissolved, arguing that it was elected illegally in that 2015 conference. What they say is there were bogus delegates that participated in the conference, and the case was dismissed based on the fact that the Bohlabela branch was still 5.5 years old when the application was made. I mean, let's break that down. What do you think of this story?
The problem, of course, with people coming 4 or 5 years down the line to say that the process was illegitimate is that it will cause the courts to ask the question of, if you are aware that these things were illegitimate, why did you wait for so long? And of course, you then have to take it a step back and try and figure out that if these individuals or these party members were disgruntled way back in 2014 or 2015, what was it that then forced them to defer launching the court action until now? And of course, it always plays down to the question of who were the political players in charge of the process back then. Perhaps this is the faction that was aligned to the political principles of the day, who then have moved, and then they're now saying that let us dismantle the entire provincial executive committee. So it is always going to be a far stretch for them to actually get some relief for the court, simply because they can't even answer the simple questions of why did you wait for so long, and of course what parts of this or what aspects of the process do you regard as illegitimate.
Yeah, I mean, and then really interesting was weekend reports saying that Themba Masofa Zgudla, this of course is a former friend of Mabuza. This is
Are there any friends in politics?
No, well, you said it, not me. They wanted to join the court bid to expose fraud in the creation of bogus branches that actually went on to elect Mabuza in 2015. You know, this case was dismissed, but the reality, what is this doing to the integrity and the credibility of the party in the Northwest?
In Mpumalanga, it is definitely an ongoing problem, because I think for the ANC, we've seen in particular past times, particularly in the Free State, where the 2012 and even the 2017 national conferences, the people that were in charge of the Free State were not allowed to vote simply because their processes were regarded as illegitimate. So what you're finding here is that it really speaks to the disjuncture or the breakup of the structures of the ANC, because obviously what you want to be able to say is that, look, if this particular process was adjudicated to have been a fair and a democratic process by the ANC itself, on what basis did it make those findings if people can now come back 4 or even 5 years down the line and say, actually, there were problems here? And of course, it is quite interesting that this young man who used to be part of the Mabuza faction, as you referred to him as a friend, is now saying that he's willing to expose what was the fraud and the corruption in the creating of those bogus branches. And of course, it shouldn't be just up to him to decide 4 or 5 years down the line that suddenly they must expose this. It should be a question of, if you you were part of it 4 years ago. Why were you part of it, and why have you decided to come forward now with this information? Because it now undermines the entire integrity of the ANC's branch processes, and of course the branch processes lead to the national conferences. So it is an ongoing problem for the ANC that probably always gets amplified in three provinces in particular, these being the Free State, Mpumalanga and the Northwest, and we all know the type of people that used to lead those particular provinces, at least until up to 2017, Nasrek.
Yeah, very interesting. So just for viewers, in Mpumalanga, it's the only province that we haven't gone on our election roadshow to. So next week, Tuesday, that is where we'll be broadcasting from Mpumalanga, so we can delve deeper into the issues that are affecting that province. The Free State, again, more court applications, and disgruntled ANC members in the province say that they're going to appeal the decision of the High Court in Johannesburg to dismiss their application regarding the party's provincial list. So the court struck the case off the roll with cost. Do you think that their appeal is actually going to work?
Not necessarily, because the court actually struck the matter off on the lack of urgency. So they came to the court and said, this is an urgent matter, it must be sorted before the elections, because once you have an election, it means that we will struggle to get the type of relief that you're looking for. So the court simply said, well, this is not an urgent matter. And of course, the court was correct in that you've had the list conferences since November. And if these individuals, they identified that actually there were problems with the particular list conference, they should have actually approached the courts much earlier. So for them to now argue that this is an urgent matter, and one of their excuses is that they've sat on it for 2 or 3 weeks because some of the legal practitioners that they approached simply didn't respond to their emails, is actually quite difficult to actually digest. So I do think that they will probably still be able to entertain a court, a court hearing, but simply the fact that it was struck off was on the fact that it was not an urgent matter. I think the merits will still be deliberated on by the courts.
All right, I want to move on to some more issues now, move away from the courts and have a look at what the political parties are doing to their supporters and for their supporters. So we saw this weekend the DA honouring several people, including HIV/AIDS activist Lucky Mazibuko and Mama Winnie Mandela's personal assistant, the former personal assistant, Zodwa Zwane. Now, Zodwa came out in full ANC regalia.
That was awkward.
Kind of was an awkward moment, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it was a photograph that was like, okay, this is an awkward moment for Mmusi Maimane. Why do you think the DA leader is actually honouring these people?
I think, of course, one of the DA's weak points is that it is seen as really not paying homage to what you might call the traditional stalwarts of the liberation movement. And of course, for them, they don't have the 100-year history of the ANC. So, of course, it's always going to be difficult for them to say this is a stalwart, a founding member of the party who's always championed a particular cause. So they will occasionally identify particular individuals who have some form of social stature to say, actually, this is a person who might be explicitly or even implicitly endorsing whatever our manifesto is or whatever our campaign is. So I think this was another attempt at that, and unfortunately it didn't work very well when it came to Mam Zodwa, because of course she came dressed in full ANC regalia to say, yes, I will entertain what you're saying, but you know exactly where my loyalties lie, and that's with the ANC. My
allegiance is there, and thanks for the honour, but you know, no thanks. Then, of course, we get the old guard coming out now. And, you know, that always happens at elections. However, not former President Thabo Mbeki. He's been in hiding ever since he was ousted. You never, ever really saw Thabo Mbeki coming out and actually electioneering for the ANC. He's now back on the electioneering trail, saying the ANC is the only party to vote for. In fact, Tony Leon has even come out and he starts electioneering, and this was in Gauteng mostly. And then you've got Julius Malema on the sidelines saying, the only reason these guys are coming out is because they're scared of us.
Well, of course, I think particularly when it comes to Thabo Mbeki, it was very surprising to a lot of people to see him coming out and actually endorsing the ANC. But I suspect that obviously 10 years or 11 years since his exile from the political office as the president of the country, he's probably then decided that, look, there is indeed a new leadership within the ANC that I can come out in full support of. It was never going to happen that he was going to come out and endorse the Zuma administration simply because of the manner of how his exit was handled. It was very clumsy and it was very badly handled. So I think right now he's sort of probably come to a consensus that, look, this is a new leadership. They weren't primarily responsible for how I was exiled from office, and they probably aren't as tainted as this administration that was in the past. So I will be able to go out and endorse them. So I think it's a big win for Cyril Ramaphosa, particularly when a person like Thabo Mbeki comes out. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to imagine that there's been some voters who've been sitting out and saying we will not vote for the ANC, who are now going to say, well, if Thabo is back on the campaign trail, then we'll do so, because you get the impression that the people who remember his leadership very well knew what the merits of his leadership were. So there wouldn't have been been the people that said, oh, we're going to ditch the ANC simply because he's no longer around. If people defected to COPE, it's very unlikely for them to come back simply because he's now decided to endorse the ANC, because COPE was formed on the basis of how the ANC treated him. The ANC has never apologized for that. They've never repented for it. So it's going to be a very difficult one. It sells very good optics, but I don't think it's going to swing a lot of voters to then say we're coming back to the ANC simply because Tabo's on the trail.
Yeah, all right, interesting. But something that got a lot of backlash was also former President F.W. de Klerk coming out and making a statement saying that apartheid South Africa was better than the 10-year rule under former President Jacob Zuma. To make a statement like that?
Completely ill-advised, but I suspect one of the key issues that we haven't engaged as a country is really this idea that some people can find justifications for apartheid and saying, well, actually, as bad as it wasn't as bad as what you've seen over the past 10 years. Of course, the ANC has to be able to explain and account for what has happened in the past 10 years, but I think probably people like F.W. de Klerk do not have a very intimate understanding of what it meant to live under apartheid rather than thrive under it. And of course, a person like him would have been the one who was thriving. He was in the political office. He was in a position of social influence. So perhaps the impact of apartheid to him is very different to what my grandmother, for example, would say apartheid was all about. So for him to come out 24 years later and say, well, actually apartheid wasn't as bad as some people think, it is completely ill-advised. And it's very unfortunate and really, really a bit of the type of thing that we shouldn't be hearing in this country. But of course, we've decided to be a country that tolerates these types of things, whether it's Helen Zille talking about colonialism and saying, but there were good parts of it. It's something that we've actually become accustomed to as a country. And what you want is for people, prominent people, to actually come out and reject the assertions that F.W. de Klerk is saying. And of course, the key issue here is that he might then say, no, this is the context that I was trying to say. But of course, we all know that the context itself is what he understands it to be. When people hear that a former apartheid leader has the audacity to actually come out and say it wasn't as bad as what you people think, it is highly, highly ill-advised.
Goodness me. All right. We're going to have to leave it there. I know there's so much more to talk about, particularly with regard to the PIC and also what's going to happen with Jiben Khwebi. Can I steal 10 seconds of your time?
They will be joining the unemployment queue very soon. I think it's very unlikely that the president is going to reject the findings of Justice Mohoro, basically because he came up with the inquiry. And of course, even if this inquiry wasn't there, you get the impression that the NPA is in need of new leadership. You've got a new leader there who probably doesn't want to be tainted by what these two particular co-leaders bring to the table. So it's better for them to leave rather than to stay.
Khaya, thank you. Always a pleasure speaking to you. Political analyst Khaya Sithole giving us some insight into the various political issues that have been happening this week. And that, of course, 12 days ahead of the 8th of May election.